Good evening to you all. Welcome to this conversation and this opportunity to learn together. My name's Matthew Petrusek, and I want to thank you for being a part of this lecture series called Reasons to Believe. And I'm blessed to be with you here again on a Friday evening of all nights. You are in the hottest event in town, in the whole Inland Empire. We're going to be talking about theology and metaphysics and logic and faith and reason. So I hope tonight does not disappoint, gets you ready and roaring for the weekend. So the last lecture, the last episode, we went through the question of truth. And I hope that you were persuaded by the very end that truth is something that we cannot avoid, that we still can talk about the truth, not just a truth or my truth or our truth, but the truth. And in fact, we can't not talk about the truth insofar as every claim that we make it believing that it is true. So we left that lecture with that conclusion, that it appears that we cannot avoid speaking about the truth, but the actual content of the truth, or what is true, remains an open question. So that's what we're going to be honing in on as we move deeper and deeper into these lectures. Today, in Lecture 2, we're looking at what I'm calling the complementarity of faith and reason. And what I mean by that basically, and of course we'll unpack this slowly, is that faith and reason should not be separated, ever, period. And in fact, one of the distinctive features about being Catholic, one of the things that makes Catholics Catholics, is that we have never, and God willing never will, pulled the two apart and said that either you have reason or you have faith, and you have to, there's sort of two diverging paths, and you have to choose one. So what I hope to persuade you by the end of this lecture is something you already know. And in fact, that's ultimately what good theology is seeking to do, is to teach you something that you already know, to make you agree with something that's already a part of you, insofar as we're all made in the image and likeness of God. It's already there. We just have to bring it to the surface. So I hope to persuade you, and this is what the church teaches us, that reason is impossible without faith, and faith is impossible without reason. And I really mean impossible. We can't even conceive of one without the other. We can't think of one without the other. So in other words, they are complementary. And I want to get us started with two motivational quotes from some great motivational speakers of ages gone by. One, St. Anselm, and the other, St. Thomas Aquinas. So you've probably heard this one. Perhaps you heard it in the Latin version of it, but it's translated as faith-seeking understanding. Faith-seeking understanding. Now, that doesn't mean that for St. Anselm or for anyone else in our tradition that we sort of accept the faith that sort of is delivered to us, sort of dropped off at our doorstep, and then we say to ourselves, well, how in the world do I begin to understand this? And that begins a process. It's more that the relationship between faith and reason is going to be one of complementarity, of one building on the other. And so when we speak about the life of faith, we're speaking about something that we're always trying to understand more and more, that is always unfolding and revealing a deeper and deeper level. The other quote here, and this is at the heart of the theology of St. Thomas Aquinas, who unfortunately is not taught too frequently nowadays, I'm hoping to change that, is that grace does not destroy nature, but it fulfills it. Now what Aquinas means there, and this is one of the most Catholic things you can possibly say, is that when we speak about God entering into time and space, when we think about God entering into our lives in a very personal way, in and through revelation, in and through the movement of the Spirit, in and through that establishing a relationship of sanctification, of grace, that God is not destroying the work that we have already done with our reason, with our thinking, with our reflection. Rather, it's a completion of that process. It's a bringing to full fruit of a part of us that is already intact and growing like a flower. So grace fulfills the natural reason that we have. It fulfills who we are, made in the image of likeness of God. It does not replace. It does not wipe out and put something totally new. So let that echo through the whole rest of the lecture, those two quotes. So what is faith? Let me first say a few things of what faith is not, because I hear a lot of faith being something like a shot in the dark. Perhaps you've heard that one, right? Do you believe in God? Yeah, I do. Well, why? I don't know. It's just like shooting in the dark, you know? You just, I believe. It's not that, because that would be arbitrary and random. And one of the fundamental features of God is not arbitrary and random. So faith is not a shot in the dark. To use a similar metaphor, faith is not jumping off a cliff. Jumping off a cliff is not advisable for anyone under any circumstances, and that includes in our spiritual lives as well. So when we're asked to believe, when we're called to believe, we're not called to walk up to a precipice and say, well, guess I'll jump. There's no explanation for why I'm doing what I'm doing. I'm just going to hop right off this cliff. It's not that. It's not just a feeling either. And I hear that a lot too. Now, let me be clear here. Faith can and does evoke some beautiful feelings. Feelings that can change your life. Feelings that can permeate your whole being. They can get down into the very sinew of your existence and grab you. Faith can and it will do that. But faith isn't reducible to those feelings. And in fact, as we'll see in just a little bit, faith is present even if you don't have those feelings, or even perhaps more psychologically helpful, even if you have the opposite feelings, meaning even if you're feeling that you don't have faith, even if you're feeling like you're wandering through the darkness at times, you can still have faith. In fact, you can have very strong faith. So we want to pull apart this connection between saying, I know I have faith if I feel I have faith, and if I don't feel I have faith, therefore I don't have faith. It doesn't follow. We need to pull those two apart. We can be grateful for the feelings. The feelings are a gift that God gives us, but we can't depend upon them because that's a false definition of faith. Faith is also not beliefs that have no explanation. So what I want to separate here is to say, well, reason are things that we can explain. Faith is, well, I have nothing to say about it. I literally have nothing to say about that. Faith is, it's ineffable in a literal sense. I can't say a darn thing about it. No, there are explanations, and there's good explanations. Now again, we are going to be marking distinctions here between faith and reason, but we can have explanations, good explanations for why we believe. Another way of saying that is faith is not having beliefs that have no evidence. There's great evidence. And what qualifies as evidence is also quite expansive, as we'll be seeing in this lecture and as these lectures unfold. Finally, faith is not belief in authority, just in sense of being something someone tells you to believe, and so you believe it, therefore that's your faith, because some other person said it. It's not just reducible to authority, although it does involve authority. So that's what faith is not. Okay, what is faith then? So faith is trust. I think the best word that we can use to capture the content or the act, both the content and the act of believing, is to say that you have trust. But there we want to specify two different kinds of trust. It's trust in what cannot be directly seen or apprehended, and that takes these two forms. One is what we can call cognitive trust, and that's trust of the mind. That's assenting to something, saying that, yes, that makes sense. I allow my mind to give into, to surrender to this truth because my mind recognizes it as true. So there's cognitive trust, but there's also, and again, we want to distinguish these but not pull them apart, there's also something we can call volitional trust as well. And that's trust of the will or the heart in the form of making a free choice and a commitment. And that gets back to this idea of faith not being reducible to feelings. Faith is a decision made in the heart with the mind. So we're going to see faith in both of those dimensions, which we can distinguish but ultimately want to see as one unity. So then, what does it mean to trust with your mind? What does it mean to assent to something? Now, I'm going to be using some, what may appear to be some specialized vocabulary, and there's always the risk that when somebody gets up to speak to you who calls himself or herself a professor, that they're going to start throwing vocabulary at you with the aim of sort of kicking up dust to confuse you so that even if I make a terrible argument and everything I say is bunk and hogwash, you still feel like something smart was said because you didn't understand it. That's not the case. I hope that's not the case, right? In fact, one of the fundamental dimensions of the truth, of the true truth, of divine truth, is that it wants to be known. It wants to be discovered. It's rooted in a living God that is seeking us out. And so if we find something that is confusing in a sense that it appears to be leading us just into absolute sort of darkness, that's probably not the truth. At the same time, truth is complicated because existence is complicated and because life is tough, and these ideas are ultimately trying to point to God. So we can't expect things to be simplistic. We can hope that they're clear, though. So I'm going to be using some terms that are a bit specialized, but hopefully will become clear as we move through them.
Do you want to fall in love with God? I'm sure we all want to. The book of Psalms contains the directions. Thousands of years ago, people like you and me talked to God out of the depths of their hearts, revealing an intimate love. Psalms are the expression of the faith in God by people around 3,000 years ago. God was not a mere abstract creator, but was present, involved, and a real person of power and emotions. Now, when we read or listen to the Psalms, we can know the intensity of this love. Entering into the influence of the Psalms, we can find a path to know and love God. To know more about the Psalms, you should get a copy of Father Mike Manning's booklet, The Psalms. It will help you to understand the 150 Psalms better as he has categorized them. He uses the technique of acts: adoration, contrition, thanksgiving, and supplication. Get your copy today and know the categories. Learn to pray with the Psalms.
Call the number on the screen or email us. You can also get it through our website. Get your copy today.
So, three different kinds of knowledge. We can think of knowledge as a kind of, as one big balloon of stuff, but it's actually helpful to make distinctions within it. So the first is what we could call empirical knowledge. Now, as you can see here, there's three different kinds, but there's two different categories. So one category, the first category, it's dependent upon experience. And what I mean by that, as we see with the definition of empirical knowledge, is that you don't know it unless you actually see it, or at least someone else sees it and tells you about it. You can't reason to it directly. You can't just sort of sit in a chair and figure it out by yourself. You have to experience it. So, for example, empirical knowledge, and these are simple examples, but they qualify. What's the population of Los Angeles? Right? Doesn't matter how much of a genius you are. You're not going to create a theorem that's going to tell you what the population of Los Angeles is. Someone's going to have to count it. It has to be experienced, right? Or the other example here, what's the average length of an elephant's trunk? Again, no formulas for that. You're going to have to go out and actually measure in order to get that number. So there's lots of kinds of knowledge that has to be experienced. But there's other forms of knowledge that don't necessarily have to be experienced, and that's logical knowledge and metaphysical knowledge. Those are not, at least in a technical sense, dependent upon experience. What do I mean by that? Well, last time we looked at the three laws of logic. Remember? The law of non-contradiction, right? That something can't be itself and its opposite. We also looked at the law of the excluded middle, right? That something either is something or it's not, and also the law of identity. We also looked at metaphysical knowledge briefly as well, and we'll unpack that more as we get into the proofs of God in later lectures. But metaphysical knowledge is basically the knowledge that we can deduce about the nature of reality that is just a feature of thinking about existence itself. Now, I know that sounds highly technical, but basically what we're talking about here is what must be in order to exist. So, what I want to argue is that faith is going to be related to all three of those. That we can't talk about empirical knowledge, meaning what we experience, or logical knowledge, the rules of our mind, or metaphysical knowledge, what we deduce about the nature of reality. We can't do any of that without faith. So let me start with empirical knowledge. How does empirical knowledge depend upon faith? Well, we're going to treat this question more specifically in an upcoming lecture on the relationship between science and faith, which is another very, very important topic, so I want to devote a whole evening to it. So we will get into this in more depth. But here, we can at least note that in order to have empirical knowledge, in order to experience things and to know them as experienced, we at least have to have some way of trusting our senses. Now, we all know that our senses sometimes deceive us, right? There's multiple different ways that we experience, sometimes daily, of our senses deceiving us. One of my favorite to point to is, and this is just if you have the most rudimentary knowledge of chemistry, right? You look at the atomic structure of how an atom is made up, and they tell us, and I'm taking this on authority, right, which doesn't mean it's irrational. The scientists tell us that we have a proton and a neutron together, surrounded by what? Electrons, right? Now, that's what makes up the most fundamental component of matter, of stuff, and we're all made of that. Everything's made of that. Everything material, at least, is made up of atoms. Well, here's the thing. There's actually more space, emptiness, inside of an atom than there is mass, stuff, which means that anytime we're looking at something or feeling something or stepping on something or talking to somebody, we're actually talking to more emptiness than we are to space, right? So if our senses were really telling us the truth, you wouldn't even see me right now. I would be basically dissipated in space if you were really truly seeing who I am, right? So we have to have some kind of way of saying, yes, I know my senses are telling me this about the world. I know that may not be totally accurate, and what I mean by that is totally coherent with the nature of reality itself, but I'm still going to believe it because I have good reason to believe it. That's going to take a jump of faith of some sort in order to do that. We also have to trust that when we're not seeing something, it actually is the way that we think it is, even when we're not seeing it. This is what we can point to in the problem of philosophy, is the problem of the universal observer. So it's one thing to say that I'm observing a particular cause and effect relationship right in front of my eyes, but how do I know that it continues to do that when I turn my back? I don't really know. I can't know, in fact, right? And I can't know if it's not only happening here, but everywhere else in the cosmos and everywhere else throughout space and time, historically and in the future. I can't really know that empirically because I'm not God. I can't see everything all the time. So I have to trust. Now, is that trust a shot in the dark? Is it just this sort of random convulsion of my will where I'm just like, well, I'm just going to, I don't know, believe it, whatever. No, it's based upon good reasons, but it's still an act of trust. Now, this all becomes very personal, the relationship between trust and knowledge, when we think about relationships. So I talked about before the assent of the mind, our mind actually believing something, and our will also affirming it, making a commitment to it. Think about trust in relationships. Think about trust in a marriage. So how can I know, or how can my wife know, that I'll be faithful to her? Now, strictly speaking, she can't know it empirically, right? Because empiricism is dependent upon senses, and sensory input is what you're getting right here and right now. So in a strict sense, we'd have to say, well, she can't know it, not in that technical sensory way, because we're talking about the future, but she can know it. Why? Because she knows who I am. And insofar as she knows who I am, it's reasonable for her to conclude about something that she's not directly experiencing, but can also know. She trusts. I trust. You trust. We do this all the time. We trust in events and realities that we cannot directly perceive, and nobody's running around saying that everybody's insane for believing that, right? We wouldn't be able to function without this kind of trust. But it is a trust. It is a form of faith. So, we already see that faith is alive and well just in how we experience the world. Well, how does logical knowledge depend upon faith? Well, how do you know, for example, and how can you prove that everything, the word everything, is not and cannot be a something at the same time? Like, well, prove that to me. And the answer is like, it just is, right? It's either everything or it's a something. That goes back to one of the laws of logic. Right? Well, prove that law of logic. What do our minds repeatedly tell us? It just is. I can't get beneath it to give you another reason. I've hit rock bottom. I've hit what in philosophy is called first principles. Or how can we know that a red rose is not and cannot be without color? It's either a red rose or it's a colorless rose. It can't be both at the same time. Again, it gets back to those bedrock principles that we have in our mind. Or how do we know a square cannot be a circle? Think of that circular square that I asked you last time to think about. Were you able to do it? Maybe you haven't worked hard enough. Keep trying, right? There's some ways in which our mind will just not let us proceed. It's like the record scratching, right? I use that metaphor with my students nowadays, like a record? A record? What's that? It's like, a record scratching. It doesn't compute. This is the example I used last time. A married man cannot be a bachelor, right? Well, why not? Again, it's the conceptual relationship between the two. I especially like this example. How do we know that when we speak about the number 0, we're not speaking about nonsense? So one of the things about language is in a literal sense, I could say anything to you. Right? I could combine words in such a way to create realities that are absurd. Right? I could talk about unicorns and gnomes and fairies and these kinds of things that are just a compilation of ideas that I put together in my head. They don't actually correspond with reality. Okay, so that's nonsense. But then I tell you the number 0. Why do we think that's not nonsense? Who here has seen a 0 in the wild? It's been captured on camera, right? It's one of the craziest things in the development of ideas is that somewhere along the line, as humanity came into itself, somebody said, no thing, 0. And again, go back to our sort of primordial human selves, interacting with nature in such a way, just trying to survive. You're always experiencing something, but then this idea comes of no thing. And it's not just a relative idea, meaning like, well, there's sometimes deer in front of me that I'm hunting, but now there's no deer, so that's 0. No, that's a relative 0, because there's still deer out there. Absolute 0, mathematical 0, means no thing. And yet we have full confidence in the number 0, right? Think of what math would be without 0. It'd be impossible. It would be absolutely impossible. And yet none of us have ever seen a 0 and cannot, by definition, see a 0. And I don't just mean the circle. I mean the actual concept. So how do we know that that's a true concept? It points to something that has validity to it. Well, we have to believe, right? We have to trust. We also get a sense of how this works by looking at what's called the basic structure of an argument. Now again, don't be put off by this. You're actually all very good at making arguments, especially in marriage, right? Especially in relationships. We're constantly making arguments to each other. Every argument has a basic structure to it. You have what's called a first premise, a second premise, and then a conclusion. So one of the most classic examples for explaining how an argument works, and this goes all the way back to ancient Greek philosophy, is to look at the classic example right here. Premise 1, all human beings are mortal. It's the first statement. Premise 2, Matt is a human. Therefore what? Matt is mortal. Now, again, that seems like so simplistic. Wow, that's really deep. Thanks for bringing me through that. But it actually is amazingly revelatory of something in our minds. We can't come to a different conclusion. None of us can do it. Doesn't matter what culture you're in, what language you speak, whether you're male or female, our minds, if we have one premise stating that and a second premise stating that, we all come to the same conclusion. We can't not do it. So then the question is, well, how do we know that structure of the argument? And if for those of you who like logic, it's called modus ponens. It's like the building block of all logic. How do we know that that structure of an argument is actually true? It appears that we can't get behind it. We can't give an explanation for it. We have to assume it in order to have any thought whatsoever. It's like built into us, and we can't give an account of it without using the very logic that we're trying to explain. So even if you want to quibble with the claim that all humans are mortal or whether or not I'm human, which you can do, right? You can argue with the premises to see if they're actually real statements about reality. But the structure itself, well, it's fixed. And again, we can't get behind. That's a big deal because we can't explain why we have that. We have to believe. We have to have faith. We can't not have faith. Our minds don't allow us to do it. Think of the statements, nothing exists. Nothing exists. I can say that to you. Nothing exists. Or another statement, something comes from nothing. Now those are metaphysical or potentially metaphysical claims. I'm trying to tell you something about the nature of reality. Nothing exists or something comes from nothing. Now what does your mind do if you let it burrow into those two claims? Nothing exists. Well, must something exist in order for me to say nothing exists? Aren't I saying that nothing exists means that nothingness does exist, which means nothingness is not actually nothingness? So here's the point. We must have faith in and before reason in order to use reason at all. That faith is sort of the invisible but real. Now think about that. Just because something's invisible doesn't mean it's not real. The invisible but real foundation to reason. Without all that substructure, which we can't give an account for, but we must necessarily presume exists, without that, we can't use reason. So in short, faith precedes reason. Reason is built atop faith. In order to understand, to make it comprehensible, first and foremost to ourselves, what the content of the creed is, we have to use empirical knowledge, meaning we have to understand that, for example, people saw Jesus die, people saw Jesus alive, people saw Jesus ascend. These are empirical events. They were events that were experienced with the senses.
People that say they don't have any faith that God exists and that the universe just kind of happened. And I'm saying, well, how is that possible? They don't have an explanation, but they believe it anyway.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. So we're the magical thinkers, right? The religious folk. We're the ones who are engaged in the fairy tales and the myths and the legends and things like that.